Ben ritrovate e ben ritrovati.
Welcome back to our lessons on the great challenges. This is lesson 3, and during this lesson we're going to develop ideas and notions and scenarios that we outlined in the first 2 lessons. I'm now going to start picking up on a topic which we partly discussed about, another paradox. I love paradoxes because they're very interesting ways with which you can analyze apparent contradictions that we have, and that future engineers and technicians and specialists will have to deal with. What is the paradox in this case? There are a number of scientific problems which I study on the evolution of our minds, the psychology of thought, so on and so forth. Believe me, there's a lot of literature on this that says that problems and dynamics such as climate warming are very difficult for us to understand for reasons which I have listed here in this slide, because the environmental crisis and global warming is a multi-dimensional aspect. A colleague of mine defined it as a hyper-object. A philosopher, in fact, sometimes invents new words, but it means that it's such a complicated, multifaceted object that you never are able to focus on it. And this person is right, because climate warming is like that. It is a non-linear process. It means that for a certain period of time I can't see any effect of this process, and then suddenly you get an extreme weather event, maybe somewhere else where you weren't expecting it, another part of the world. It's a very complex system where there are many causes that interact, and these causes interact in a non-linear manner. And it's also a relatively slow process in terms of what we're able to cope with month after month, even considering the calendar of politics. It's a process that requires a decade's increase of temperature. So we're now an increase of 1.1 degrees centigrade. Soon we're going to be 1.5 degrees centigrade. It's a process within which we are part of, but which we don't see the end of. And it's a distant process. Very often it concerns time and space that is not close to us, while our studies tell us that we are prepared to take an ethical stand if we see the consequences of our actions. But when they tell us, well, you have to change the way in which you consume, you have to change your model of development, we have to make decisions so that, say, in 2050 or 2060 you will have positive effects, is something very difficult for us to see. It means that you have to see at a distance, and then we've spoken about it already. Then we have statistics, averages, means, medians. They're all very difficult concepts that require an explanation and good communication. And then lastly, it's in green. I'm not going to debate on these issues now, but there are also political paradoxes that make it very difficult to deal with these problems. Why am I giving this example? Because this is a classical situation where technical knowledge, science, technological knowledge, social science, and even philosophy of science, as we will see in lesson 4, have something to say about it. Why have they got something to say about it? Because these humanities enable you to understand relationships, complexities, interdependencies. I act in one way before, then I have an effect after. So they're not over-focused and enable us to have a very interesting key. For example, in humanities, we've had a debate, as you can see here, of this divergence between salvific role and integrated role. What role can technology have in this? The ones that you'll be working with. There are 2 schools of thought, and so you can decide to opt for one or the other. This is the debate which is underway. That is to say, there is one whereby is called the salvific role, a bit of a provocation, or technically a tactical role. That is to say, we should develop technologies such as geoengineering, carbon dioxide capture. So how you can capture and store it in a limited space. So that these technological changes enable us to adapt and we can intervene very rapidly on climate warming, global warming. And we can therefore manage the social and political aspects. Probably you've read in the media and a new language which emerged with COP26, the last meeting, COP26, this dealt with the main great crisis that we have, that is to say, global warming. You will have noticed that the language is changing. People used to say we have to slow down the process, we have to mitigate, we have to block it. Now you might have noticed that people are talking more and more about adapting to the process. And it's a sort of word that we use in evolutionary science. What does it mean? It means that the world has changed and I have to find strategies to adapt. It also means something else very important. It also means that climate change, this challenge, has already started. It's not the future. It's not something that we will have to deal with in a decade or so on, but that there is an inertia and we therefore have to deal with it and adapt to a change which is already underway and which has already happened in part. And we hope that it will not be unleashed without any control in years to come. This is something that you will hear in your career. This is a technocratical approach. It is an approach which puts technologies in the forefront. The other one, the other approach is on integration, where technologies can work combined with other aspects. It's an integrated approach. In other words, it suggests that we will not be able to solve it with one-off wonder technological solutions unless we have an incredible discovery, and for example, we have nuclear fusion, or we can simulate in lab photosynthesis, that many labs are trying to do. It would be wonderful. It would be a real revolution. But we can't just pin our hopes and expectations on those solutions. So someone says we have to understand that technology interacts with all a series of other events. So it's an integrated role. Technologies have to be targeted. They have to be combined with lifestyle and policy changes. The changes of the rules of the game, for example, in terms of the organization of industry and manufacturing. Circular economy is very important. It's another key word that you will be using a lot, creating process engineering and control of the process so that everything goes back in. It's a circular notion. There are degree courses on this, training people who will be reviewing the entire manufacturing system. Now, in this case, technology interacts with all the rest and helps us not only to adapt on the situation of emergency, but also to mitigate. Clearly, that requires a much longer time, but to mitigate the process. In this case, it's not a technocracy, but it's a technophily. We want technology to help us, but without it being on its own, without being an alibi for others, with others. I'll give you a case in point of a very recent analysis of an episode that took place mid-October. There was a very big international conference in China, which took place in China, and it was parallel to COP26, and it was the crisis of biodiversity, which is another one of our big challenges, which concerns all the various facets of our lives, including engineering. The World Panel met in China, and after a few days of meeting, they objectives that were listed are rather limited. They thought that it would be nice to protect at least 30% of terrestrial and marine areas by 2030, which is an objective that cannot be attained, very unrealistic, and also to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples, and we'll talk about that, and local communities. That is to say, the rights of the communities who live where there is more biodiversity. There was no real commitment that emerged from this conference, so many consider it a failure. But a lot of people consider COP26, especially the youngsters, the ones who are your age, consider it a failure. I'm saying this because there is a technical aspect on what we should and must do, but there's also issues which are related to the timeline, the social impact, politics, what we want to do, and on the commitments that we will take. And this is where humanities come into play and can help us. So the first point which I would like to mention for today is that with a few examples, because I don't like to only have theoretical lessons, but I'd like to give practical examples. I was saying, so with a couple of practical examples, I would like to show you how the classical algorithm of engineering, which you saw here, humanities, problem solving, breaking down the problems in all its parts, and quantification, is fundamental. It's fundamental also for those who work in my field. So understand what the problem is, identify the possible solutions, compare them, compare the ones with the others, and solve problems that may be related to design, planning, science, or fundamental science, or linked to the type of solutions that we need to meet the challenges. And then you have to break it down so that we then have it in more digestible bite sizes, so to speak, and measure them. But there's a but also which is very important. But also, as you've probably realized, none of the big challenges of engineering and for the future can avoid the ecology of the problem. I haven't written it here, but that's what I mean. That is to say, what relationships underlie the problem that you're dealing with. That is to say, a given solution that I want to plan. What type of impact has it got? Not only from a technical point of view, but from a social, environmental one. What impact will it have on human health? This is a comprehensive or integrated approach. The context, you have to understand what type of contextualization the problem has. History, that is to say, the history of that problem. And in particular, this is what we will be dealing with in our lesson today. History is very important. History is not just a sequence of dates that you studied in schools. Here, history means something different. When you're faced with a problem that has to be solved in terms of design or planning or whatever, the fact that you know the history of that problem, the history of the concepts and ideas that underlie it, it's a sine qua non, it's essential. And I suggest that you really do it, because what happened in the past, the deep past that underlies that problem, very often contains suggestions, ideas, but above all, it'll help you find solutions. While in lesson 4, we will focus more on methods. That is to say, in the end, engineers, physicists, scientists, people who study the statics of a building, those who are involved in a scientific problem, what method do they use today? This is something that humanities debate too, because this is one of the topics of the philosophy of science. But today we will talk about history. Why? Well, let's have a first example. Anthropocene is the key word. And you see that Anthropocene is an old story. I started with a statement which is a bit of a provocation. Why am I saying this? Well, because as we saw in the first two lessons, if you look into the deep past, you will realize how the word Anthropocene has many meanings. In a moment, I will show you how it was started. It's in fact part of your syllabus. We talk about Anthropocene as the time in which we're living now, as what happened in the past. Someone says that Anthropocene is our future and what will happen and what we will have to deal with in years to come. What is it? What does the word mean? It's a very special word. It's a totem word. It's a word that triggers reactions that are very often irrational and unpredictable. I'll show you, going back to something that we saw in another lesson. If you study this chart, it's really very, very important. It's the calendar of life. How much time we've had, what has happened. The calendar of life is a very simple exercise. You can do it. Imagine a year from January the 1st to December the 31st. And imagine that in that year, you have the history of life on Earth. Very simple calculation. The first cell more or less developed around about 3.7, 3.8 billion years ago, and the 31st of December is where we are now. Every day of the year are about 10 million years. Every 24 hours, 10 million. So you see now how time goes by, January, February, March, and you see where and how the most important events of evolution took place. And you discover some things as really surprising. I'm just going to skim over it because we haven't got too much time. You can use this chart and look at it. Until November the 2nd, so a lot of time has gone by, 10 months out of 12, life was microbial. We said it talking about pandemics. Viruses and bacteria have been around for a very long time. But here you see how long for a very long time, until November the 2nd, which means that up until November the 2nd, we only had a single-cell organisms, fungi, bacteria, viruses, protozoa, and so on. They did a lot of things. They invented photosynthesis. They made it possible for the atmosphere to be breathable for us. But that's what they were. One cell, single-cell organism. Only from the 3rd of November, we have more complex organisms. And then plants. And then animals. For a long time, there were microbes, and then microbes and plants. As we have seen, this is the planet of plants. 90% of the biomass, that is to say, of all living things on this planet, are plants. So when you think of relationships, don't forget that plants account for 90% of the biomass. Then complex animals start at the end of November, dinosaurs in December too. And dinosaurs, as you can see, become extinct with the asteroid hitting the Earth, and then Christmas Eve, December the 24th, about 10 p.m., that's when dinosaurs become extinct. The day after Christmas, Boxing Day, primates like us develop, and this is the last week of the year, and there are still no human beings around. And then you see the other dates, the 31st of December at 10 in the morning. Here in Africa, we have the first ancestor of our species. So at long last, on December the 31st at 10 a.m., you have the first. We haven't found a fossil, but we know that it existed in Africa. We know that this is the link between us and the rest of the world. And here you can see on 31st of December at 11:32, 28 minutes before midnight, we appear. We're the last 28 28 minutes. We're the last half an hour of that calendar. So when we interact with ecosystems, when we interact with pathogens, when we interact with animals and plants, we must remember that we're the last in, not because of a moral reason, but because of a scientific reason, for a practical reason, because the people who are on this planet and has been on this planet for much longer than we have has more of an evolutionary history. While we discover and destroy the ecosystem, we are damaging ourselves because we're vulnerable, because we're the last in this great long history. At this point, you can connect this with what we saw in other lessons. We're the last 28 minutes, but in those last 28 minutes, we have done what we saw at the beginning. You remember in lesson 1, we created that human-made mass, enormous, which in the past 120 years has become equal to and then exceeded all living biomasses. And you see, we use metals, asphalt, bricks, aggregates, concrete, the things that you will use in your work. These are the materials that mean that the human-made mass exceeds the living biomass. In the past 28 minutes, see it from another point of view. Homo sapiens, we're the 0.001% of all the land biomass, the global biomass, and this is what we've done in 100 years. I think that this is the best definition of Anthropocene. We came in last. We filled the world with our things. We've changed the world. We have in fact, filled it with anthropocenic masses. We have some environmentalist scientists who believe that it is virtually impossible to find an environment that is virgin, that is to say, without any impact of negative impact in this case due to human activity, so much so that you probably read about it. It's incredible. We've found microplastic, very small, 1/3 of a millimeter at the end, at the bottom of the ocean. It's very difficult to find anywhere on this planet which is not marked by a human presence. This is the Anthropocene, and then you can decide to represent it with these pictures, the pictures that we saw in lesson 1. I'm going to add one more to it because this too is very important to understand relations. If you look, this is a website where you can download a lot. It's called ourworldindata.org, as you can see at the bottom. It's an extraordinary website. It's very important for learning because you will find online all sorts of information with this very interesting graphic representation. There are many projects now that are called the graphic data. That is to say, the data are represented by different graphs, and you can see the impact. Here you can see all the mammals on Earth, and you see that we are 34% of the mammal biomass, but 62% are cattle and sheep and buffaloes and horses, and only 4% are wild animals. So you can visualize it. These are the figures, the facts and figures that explain what the Anthropocene is. This gentleman you can see here, who was called Paul Crutzen, he died at the beginning of 2021. I suggest that you go and read what he did because he was a great chemist. He won the Nobel Prize, and I'll tell you why. Because he was one of the first people who understood, again, the result of human engineering, the dynamics underlying the fact that there was a production of certain gases, CFCs they were called, and the impact that they had on the ozone layer, which exists in the stratosphere. He was the one who understood that these gases were causing a thinning of the ozone layer, and the ozone layer is very, very important for us because it acts as a filter. It filters a number of radiations which would otherwise cause terrible damages to cells and would cause genetic mutations that can be very dangerous, especially for mammals. and the thinning of the ozone layer is very dangerous for us. So he understood all of that, and beware, this is very interesting. Thanks to his scientific studies, which gave him the Nobel Prize, they then drafted in 1987 the Montreal Protocol, and the scientists worked with politicians. It's a protocol that was signed by all the nations in the world, or great majority. The protocol foresaw an engineering revision of all the industries that were using and releasing these gases, CFCs, in the atmosphere. Why am I talking about the Montreal Protocol and saying that you should look at it? Because it's a success story. It worked. We have the data. 1987, we went to see what happened in 97, in 2007, 2017. It's more than 30 years, and it worked. It has meant that there is a reduction of the thinning out of the ozone layer. Now, you've heard that in the past 2 or 3 years it's getting worse again, but that's nothing to do with it. It's a side effect. It's another one of those non-linear side effects I was mentioning at the beginning due to climate warming. Now, the reference to the CFCs is the reference to a success story. Why am I saying this? And I will be referring to this again at the end of this lesson. When you analyze context, when you talk about these global challenges, you end up by saying, well, if it's so complicated, if there are all these problems, we're so small, we can't do anything about it. We have to accept the fact the situation is catastrophic, there will be an apocalypse. No. We have a lot of data. We have many case studies, thanks to the models that tell us that if we intervene, and we intervene swiftly, and we intervene on a global level, and we decide that we're going to change, say, the way in which an industrial network works, then you can see and measure 10, 20, 30 years down the line, you can measure the results. This is why I'm giving you this example, because Paul Crutzen is a case in point. If we really undertook to do things now with immediate results, and then we were to measure them at 5, 10, 20, 30 years, science would tell us, and also the fundamental science and engineering tell us that we could see the results and that we could quantify them very precisely. But this is not why I'm talking about Paul Crutzen. Paul Crutzen was a scientist who also loved inventing new words. You weren't even born, but he was the one who a long time ago invented the word nuclear winter. That is to say, he started to calculate the potential effect that there would have been in the event of the explosion of a certain percentage of nuclear weapons. And I'm not joking about this. He went there and calculated what would happen day after, and the day after, the month after, a year after. And he called it nuclear winter, because you know that one of the effects would be the lowering of a temperature because of the dust that would stop the sunlight reaching the earth. This study also led to a movie which was very successful called The Day After, and many other movies and books and so on and so forth. This happened a long time ago, the 1990s. While after, towards the end of the 90s, Paul Crutzen started to develop another word, which you would have understood is Anthropocene, because he is the one who invented this word with someone else, an ecologist, Eugene Storman. In any case, they were at a conference. It was the year 2000 at Cuernavaca in Mexico. They were talking about other things, about geological eras and so on and so forth. And he stood up and said, well, come on, enough. Let's stop talking about Pleistocene, Holocene, and now we have reached Anthropocene, the Anthropocene era. He invented it, which means that it's the geological era. It's recent, which concerns us, dominated by humans, Anthropocene. Initially, it was considered a joke. But as I was telling you, it has become a totem. That is to say, it has a life of its own. It was incredibly successful. They started talking about it, newspapers referred to it. Paul Crutzen, in the light of the interest, wrote an article on Nature, which is a very important scientific journal, where he said exactly what he meant by this. And a few years later, in 2009, 9 years later, after the word was first spoken, the International Stratigraphic Committee that measures and names the various geological eras took in consideration the idea of adding it. Here you can see also the cover of a very beautiful exhibition, which I suggest you go and see. It's a photographic exhibition where Anthropocene is represented in a very emotional and intuitive manner. Very beautiful. In any case, to cut a long story short, science decided to take Paul Crutzen seriously and to introduce the Anthropocene. But to date, the word has not yet been officially accepted. Why? Because there's a problem. And this is what I'm going to talk about here, because this is where humanities come into play. For instance, in the group, the working group that has to decide whether Anthropocene should be introduced, there are also philosophers of science, sociologists, historians, as well as engineers, geologists, earth scientists, and so on. It's an interdisciplinary working group, as all the big important groups are like the ICC on climate or biodiversity or biotechnologies. There are philosophers that are part of the working groups too. Why? What's the problem that they have to solve? We don't know when it started, and we don't know how to measure it. So once again, it's a technical problem. My key to it, I'm going to try and show you how we could solve the problem or deal with it. It's the one which I gave you in lessons 1 and 2. That is to say, Anthropocene is basically the history where we change the world and the world changes us. Think of the biomass versus human-made mass, and we then have to adapt to it. It's the same story over and over again, which I've repeated time and time. You have to adapt to a world, but a world that we have modified ourselves. So climate change is a big challenge, but a great challenge, but it's like a big evolutionary experiment of how we adapt to change. Let me now reword this in a different way. With some geographers of the Padua University, which is where I work, in the past few years, we worked on something else, which was quite interesting, called a paroxystic scenario. What does it mean in simple English? Well, let us imagine that things go in the worst possible way, that we don't do anything to mitigate climate change, or climate warming goes on, that we don't do absolutely anything to meet the great challenges. We imagine a series of non-linear effects and amplification. So my colleague said that in this case, in a matter of a few centuries, 6, 7, the seas might rise quite substantially, like 60 meters. I mean, this happened in the Pleistocene. The sea was 10 or more meters more than it is now, or lower. So it's an old story. But it has been stable so far, but we are now tinkering with this stability. So the geographers have tried to imagine what Italy would be in the case of the Anthropocene running forward unleashed. And here you can see, for example, the northeast of Italy, how the coastlines would change. And you can see the depth of the sea, how it would change, the hills that become islands, new peninsulas, and how the geography of Italy would change substantially. Italy would be different. People would have to move. There would be migrations. And Here you can see what Italy would look or could look like in the year 2700, and we imagined a journey across Italy. In the Italy of the future, we went to see Turin because you're in Turin. Here it is. Turin clearly is quite safe, but only apparently, because you see the sea goes right up to the rice paddies of the Vercelli Novara area, but basically you have to imagine that the area would become a desert. And you have to imagine a world that would be really very different. And here you can see the map of Italy in the Anthropocene. Italy has shrunk substantially. One part has become a desert. The Mediterranean has become a tropical sea, and a series of other effects. New lagoons, new islands. One might say, right, do we care what is going to happen in 700 years? Just like we might not be interested in the distant past. We're not interested in seeing the distant future. No, we are. Beware, beware, because if you read into this model, you discover something which is very important and rather disquieting. That is to say that all the processes, that the results of which you see here, deserts and the shift of plants, animals and plants migrating, are already happening now. Of course, we don't see them as clearly. They're just budding. They're like embryos. Sometimes we have to really look for them, but they're already happening. One example. The salt level. Now, the salt water levels are changing. In Venice, they're starting to realize what's happening slowly and silently. Salt water is penetrating into our lands. That is to say, the saltwater intrusion is increasing, and it is in fact contaminating the water tables. This is very important because the land then becomes sterile. The land is barren. This is happening in Apulia. It's happening in Ferrara. So you see this map here seems to be a map which is in the distant future, but the beginning of the process is already with us. This is an example which might help you understand, but you have to think in long terms. You have to have a long view into the past and a long view into the future. What is happening now is the beginning of what will happen, of a trajectory that might go one way or the other. This is why and how we add something important. Thanks to philosophy of science, this is why you must never accept, when in the future you will be engineer and scientist, you must never accept forecasts. People will ask you, journalists will ask you, people will ask you, the population, tell me what will happen in 60 years' time. And you have to answer, I'm sorry, I can't tell you, because science is not magic. Science is not something that can tell you exactly what will happen by the year 2100 or 2100, sorry. Why? Well, because it depends what decisions we will make. So science does something different. It projects, it makes projections. It says, if we go on like this, this is what will happen. There is a trajectory, and this is what will happen. So in the year, say, in 100 years, what will happen? We will be at this point of the trajectory. If, on the other hand, we will implement a series of mitigating actions, will be different. If we won't do anything, this will be the trajectory, and so on. You outline scenarios, and within these scenarios, this is very important, you study probabilities and risk in particular. That is to say, the probability of a dangerous event taking place. this. These are scenarios that talk about the probability of us going in one direction or the other. So when in the future as scientists or engineers, they will ask you for a certain forecast, say no. But you can have a projection. Calculating risk, yes. And they're very important because they tell us a lot about what we have to do today. Just like a seismic risk and earthquake risk, many of you will be studying these things. Well, you say, yes, it's just a probability, but it's very important because it tells you that in a certain land, in a certain area, you will never be able to say, at the present state of the knowledge, when you will have an earthquake, but you will be able to say that there is certain probability of it happening, that there will be an earthquake of a certain order of magnitude. And that's very important information, and it's plenty for you to decide then to implement prevention. Now, I'm stressing this because you will see that it is very difficult to convey this idea to people who are not engineers or not scientists. It's very difficult for them to understand how important prevention is, because there are notions of prevention, risk, trend. It's very difficult to appreciate for our minds to understand them. This was a teaching model, but now we have to answer the two questions which I had raised. That is to say, how do you measure the Anthropocene and when did it start? And then I'll give you an example of one of these important aspects, that is to say, the sixth extinction. First of all, let us go to the ingredients. Here you can see in this chart there are very many ingredients. There's something which has to do with population growth. Clearly, then there are also the greenhouse gases, but then there are also, for example, the reduction of biodiversity on this planet, and so on and so forth. And then, and here you can't see them because it would become too complicated, there are also the multiplicator effect, which are very important. If there is, for example, if the permafrost melts in Siberia, possibly connected to to the fires which there have been in Siberia, this is already a co-effect, a multiplying effect, but the melting of the permafrost releases very strong gases, the methane, which is one of the greenhouse gases, and so it reacts and accelerates global warming, which in turn favors catastrophic fires. There's a cause which then generates an effect which retroacts or loops back and feeds back into another effect. This is what Anthropocene is. This is the non-linear system. So when you have to think of solving problems, it's very complicated and you have to bear this in mind. As you can see it's very clear that each and every one of these ingredients interacts the one with the other, and this means that it soars once again immediately after World War II. It's exactly the same graph that you saw with the anthropogenic graph. So we're going back to the same topic which we have raised, that is to say, the great acceleration which took place. We, as evolutionists, talk about this because you can clearly see that the rhythm, the slope changes. Something happened. It was a turning point. And this brings us to the fact that in 2020, 2021, the anthropogenic or human-made mass exceeds the biomass. So very difficult to calculate. When should it begin? And here, I'm certainly going to go back. I'm going to go back. Why? Because my idea, which I'm sharing with you, but I'm telling you that it's not the only one. There are at least another two, and I'm not telling you that mine is the best or it's right. But my idea is that Anthropocene starts very, very early in time. Why? Because it's human evolution. Human evolution is not like this. This is the first one. This is a parody from The Simpsons, and the Simpson writers know a lot about science, but they imagine a linear progressive evolution which then reaches Homo sapiens, which is Homer's sapiens. But it's never a linear process. Evolution is not, but it goes like this. As you can see in this chart, this is the famous bushy tree of human beings. Why? Because it's very important to know how we get. At the beginning, we have the common ancestor between us and the chimpanzees 6 million years ago. Time goes, as you can see it on the charts, and it branches out. It's a progress, and there are different branches, new species, and you see that between 2 and 3 million years ago, there were very many human species on Earth. Then many became extinct, and then from a certain moment onwards, you can see that there are blue-purpley lines which once again branch out and take us to today, which you can see is the final line, which is where we are now. This is the timeline of human evolution. Soon I will show you what that has to do with Anthropocene. Here you can see there are different human species, and bear in mind that we know that more than 25, maybe 26 human species have walked this earth. A very complex, fascinating story that we have only recently started to understand. Now, within this bush of evolution, you can see some very interesting aspects. There's no time here, and this is not the focus of this lesson. But you will find all the great adaptations, how humans adapted. Early technologies, for instance, did not start as you studied many years ago with the Homo habilis, the first one. No, it's not true. Tools, even stone tools, pre-existed. In fact, the Australopithecus used them, and before the history of the genus human, then erect posture, the fact that meant we could use our upper limbs, migrating, language, all the great novelties have appeared in different times and places. And then you can see the little circles, a very recent discovery which changed the entire paradigm of interpretation of human development. We discovered that until a few millennia ago on this planet, so there were at least 4, if not 5 or 6 human species, distinct ones. They were human species, so we Homo sapiens in this big bush, we're the last. And so we're going back to the calendar of life, we're the last in. We are that last little branch that you can see on the right. Homo sapiens. We just born in Africa 200 millennia ago, about 8,000 generations. So 8,000 father to son, or 4,000 from grandparent to grandchild. But until 40, 50,000 years ago, there were others on the earth. There were Neanderthals in Europe, the Denisovians, the 2 pygmy species, and in South Africa there may have been others, many other human forms. And so the scientific question is, well, if there were so many of us, why are there only human beings like us? Why are there Homo sapiens, 8 billion of them, distributed throughout and all descending from a very small population of African pioneers? Well, the answer is in a map like this. We have now learned to reconstruct a human history through maps, through geography. Bear that in mind. Geography, which is very often belittled, is a key area of study, essential to understand our world. Social, physical, human geography Geography is very important to understand movements, to understand what is happening. In particular here, you have the answer to the question, why are there only why there's only our species on land and why there were many others before? Because we're migratory people, migratory animals. We've understood this in the development of human beings. Migration and movement is extremely important. Why? Because you must follow resources, you must seek for the best habitat, and as we said, since climate, the ecology has changed over time, what has been our strategy to adapt? To move. Move. And here you can see the first out of Africa, the first diaspora out of Africa, which coincides with the major climate changes in the Pleistocene, which 2 million years ago meant that people moved not to the Australasian area, not to the Americas, but to all the others. By scattering throughout the world, these people have become different species. They have diversified. So from one great population of pioneers, they fragmented in Asia, one in Europe, one in Africa, and we've known this for a few years. But only recently do we know the second out of Africa. We discovered that these migrations did not happen a few times, but were an ongoing process, continuous processes. This is the second great migration. It started a long time after, 800,000 years ago, and it's another great move out of Africa. Here it's another species. The other one was called Homo ergaster, and this is Homo heidelbergensis, but these technical terms are not important. But the basic problem is that humans are again spreading throughout the world. So here you can see this attitude that we're an invasive species or migratory species. We expanded throughout the world with great ability to adapt. Here you can see, for instance, to work in Beijing or to live in Beijing is very different from living in South Africa or in Spain. After this major expansion, human populations fragmented again, generating different species, but with an additional element that here the migratory populations of the second out of Africa have to cohabitate with the first one. So there's a progressive stratification, layers, continuous movements, and the fact that populations have to live together. This gentleman that you can see here, this is something that we did for an exhibition, which then was part of an exhibition, is a Neanderthal. Gentleman of a certain age, because the Neanderthals lived up to 50, 55, which for us it means still young, but at the time it meant being very old. They had a very advanced culture. They used to wear clothes and hats, and they had learned how to use needle and thread, and they had a very sophisticated culture. But they have disappeared. What happened? Well, a long time ago, Anthropocene started. Here you can see another map, and you can see in green the area where the Neanderthals lived, which in turn were the children of the second great migration out of Africa, which had started 600,000 previously. So they were the real Europeans. They were the children of African migrants, but as a species they developed in Europe. What happened after a certain amount of time, about 120 and 130,000 years ago? There was another migration. This time the migration was led by Homo sapiens, by us. We too, born in Africa, left Africa, and at this point we discovered what had happened. By leaving, we did not find a world where there were no other human beings. There was a world full of other species. Why? And we understood this recently, because the others were the descendants of the previous migrations, of all those who had left Neanderthal, the pygmy species, the others that remained blocked on an island. So When we left Africa, we met up with them and we cohabitated with them. For a long time, we lived side by side in an apparently peaceful manner. Maybe, well, think, for example, we also exchanged an object. We discovered, for instance, that some of the technological inventions by Neanderthals or by sapiens were found in a certain place, and then after a while you find them in another place where the other species was, which means that either they copied them or they exchanged them or stole them. Who knows? We don't know what happened, but there were certainly exchanges, cultural exchanges, and something which is really surprising, because when we studied them up to 2 or 3 years ago, said the exact opposite, but this happens with science. We discovered that during this, they also mated. That is to say, for example, the father could be a sapiens and mother a Neanderthal. They had children, and these children, who were hybrids, were healthy. That is to say, they reached adult life, and they in turn had offspring. So part of the Neanderthal DNA ended up in our descendants, and we have it all because we are the children of those who were the mixture with the Neanderthals, and between Neanderthals and sapiens, our DNA it's a bit like a harlequin. We have genetic tesserae of other species. So this is very important from a scientific point of view, because it means that our genome is not pure. It's a collection of contribution of different human species. And if you think that this doesn't concern us, don't forget that one of these is a Neanderthal sequences, which we have in chromosome 3, causes, for example, exposes us to COVID-19 more easily. So something which happened tens of years ago randomly has had an impact on the recent pandemic. So these events of the past shed a light on the present. So you can imagine a photo like this. In the past, two individuals, two different species met. And this cohabitation happened in Asia, in the Middle East. Here you see there's an area which is Central Asia, the Altai Mountains, Lower Siberia, close to Mongolia, Kazakhstan and Russia. Here, 3 human species cohabitated. The Denisovians, that was the original ones there, then Neanderthal, and then sapiens, the orange arrow. And they cohabitated and they mixed. It's an exceptional discovery which rightly was described on the cover of Nature, because the Denisovians in the Altai areas, there was a young woman who died. We don't really know why, but we found remains of her bones, and from that we were able to extract DNA, because now we managed to do what Jurassic Park did, that is to say, from the fossils of extincted animals. Sometimes we're able to, not with dinosaurs because they're too old, they became extinct too long ago, but for species such as these that were extincted 100,000 years ago, you can still extract it, and we see that this girl had a father of one species and a mother of another one. So she was a hybrid, a first-generation hybrid. So in this article it says female born to a Neanderthal mother and Denisovian father roughly 90,000 years ago, nicknamed Denny. Many examples of interbreeding between and among ancient human groups. Here you can see the connections between the various species. But let us go back to Anthropocene, because this has to do with it. Because at this point, the question is different. Imagine the situation right up to 40, 50,000 years ago. On this planet, there were 5 different species. Then something happened. Something which is still mysterious to this day, something which was very swift and fast, and between 60 and 50,000 years ago, right up to 40,000 in fact, all the other human species disappear and we're the only one remained. What happened? Why? There were lots of us because we met them, we've explained that. We're migrants. But why at a certain point? After the balance and everything, and the fact that we interbreeded, they all disappeared and we remained. This is a big mystery of science. May have to do with technology, language, social organization, or possibly with another migration outside Africa, which is the final wave. A big final wave. Human beings which were particularly aggressive, more invasive, and they caused an imbalance, which meant that we submerged and replaced all the other species. That's when Anthropocene begins. Why? Because at this point, this is when one human species overtakes the others, starts to spread throughout the world and changes the world where it arrives. It shapes the ecosystems, very often impoverishing them. Here you can see this global map. Wonderful, because you can see all human migrations. Here you can see Africa, Homo sapiens, expansion, Middle East, Eastern Asia, Europe, and then after 45,000 years, but even before then, some go up to the Arctic, surviving in extreme conditions. They then go east, reach eastern Siberia, they cross the Bering Sea, enter the Americas, and then go down, 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 right up to the tip of South America and then Australia. A big world migration. This is the beginning of the Anthropocene. For example, when the first human beings arrived in Oceania, that is to say in the Australasian area and in South America and North America, the world changes. All the big mammals disappeared. We had them for lunch. We ate them. These are the big mammals that had not been in touch with a predator like us. No predators. We arrived. We're hunters, aggressive, well organized, small groups, very mobile, very adaptable. And we then hunted them to extinction. The herbivores died and then the carnivores died as a result. So imagine, let's focus on Australia. These are the recent discoveries made through DNA, and we're studying them in Padua too. Human groups between 60 and 65,000 years ago entered from two corridors, one Timor East, Papua New Guinea. They entered this great continent that at that time was in fact one with Tasmania, Papua New Guinea, and they changed it completely because they hunted the great mammals to extinction. They started using fires to open up new roads and created, I'm exaggerating a bit, but not that much, they created the Australian landscape as we know it today. Human beings, not nature per se. That is to say, human beings who are the forebears of the Australian Aborigines who are now discriminated and have been since the arrival of the whites, but their ancestors were the ones who throughout the millennia, co-evolving with the environment, transformed it. And so then you understand how they have a very different relationship with landscape and with the land from ours. It's a very ancient history. Then if you look at this map with the green dots, and I'm just skimming over it because it's the same concept, history repeats between one glaciation and the others, right up to the end. We're now around about 30,000, then 20,000, then 18,000 years ago, right up to 11,000 years ago. Human beings at this point only Homo sapiens, learn how to domesticate animals. Here you can see another aspect. These are the points when all this started. Domestication of plants and animals is not only in the Fertile Crescent, but it is a great transition which led to new migrations, new movements of population, and once again, literally, it shaped the planet. Henceforth, very few animals and plants will have a great evolutionary success thanks to us. Sweet corn, wheat, spelt, rice. In terms of the animals, certain types of cattle or pigs or other animals have sheep, ovines. The atmosphere changes, the landscape changes, these animals have more success, demography changes, and biodiversity collapses. Biodiversity halved over this time within a few millennia. It halved. This is Anthropocene. So if things are like this, Anthropocene started a long time ago. By the way, suggestion that I give from an evolutionary point of view, a phenomena such as this has to be assessed looking at it at a distance. Who domesticated what? In the sense that we have chosen certain plants, so we selected them, and this was genetic engineering, and we created domesticated plants. But in fact, from another point of view, they used us, these plants used us to be more successful, because if nowadays, don't forget what I showed you on mammals, if an ET looked here and said, which are the most successful animals in terms of biomass, they would say domestic animals. So, because we concentrate them in terrible conditions. So you see, an evolutionary point of view helps you to have a very different gaze. And now let us move on to see this in the future. Extinction of the megafauna, we migrate, then domestication of plants and animals. What's happening now? Well, after not the agricultural revolution, but after the industrial and then the digital revolution that we've had, and the great acceleration that we've had after World War II, the game goes on. That is to say, that through our human activities, we're continuing to play this game, which is very dangerous but has given us great advantages, and we're modifying the environment around us. So new revolutions, here you can see it, deserts of the world that are becoming increasing or changing, while other areas are, the rain is falling. Madagascar is in a very dangerous situation due partly to the deforestation of the past decades. Here you can see the global warming impacts on biological system. It should be called global warming because climate change is a word that was used by those who were skeptical at the beginning on the human role compared to the... So they used something neutral, climate change, but it should be called, what is happening today is global warming. That is to say, the world is much hotter. Here you can see the biological impact on ecosystems. So this is the Anthropocene, which concerns the very distant past, the present, and here you can see the projections on the future. And this is a situation which is not in our favor. And I will come back on this at the conclusion of the lesson. Here, the Italian example is a case in point. Look at this map. These are the maps of the vulnerability within this great challenge, within the global challenge. Potential vulnerability to climate change. Red areas and dark red are the most vulnerable to climate change from all points of view. Here you can see it has to do with hydrogeological problems, higher sea levels. We've said everything. Here you can see something which is very important, that Italy with Spain and Greece and with other areas of Europe is a hot spot, and it's very dangerous. That is to say, it's an area which is very unstable and of great vulnerability to climate warming. We're a transition area for human migration. We know that very well. And Italy is also an area of great biodiversity. People forget it, but Italy is the country in Europe with the greatest biodiversity. So we're the ones who've got more to lose within this global challenge. Your responsibility, your task is very important. One last slide here. You can see I spoke about mobility, I spoke about migration, I talked about the Anthropocene. Here you can see new displacements associated with conflicts and disasters in 2015. And here you can see the same maps now projected on 2050. And you will discover that between here and 2050, the UN think that 250 million people will be forced to leave where they live. They will be forced. This will be their choice. They won't be there discussing, shall I or won't I migrate? They will have to move because there won't be any more water. The land will not be fertile, it'll be barren, and they will have to do it. 80% of these will remain within their state because nobody really, or very few, like to abandon the land where they've lived, and so they will congregate in cities. 20% will change countries, and only 5%, but there are a lot of them in any case, will migrate and will be displaced to another area. This too is a global challenge, great challenge, which has to do with the previous challenges, and which I'll call you to think about. You have to think about it. To live in a world where tens of millions of people cannot remain in the place where they are because it's become barren, while other parts of the world will have an advantage because they will become good areas. This is an enormous global problem because clearly I can't take the people who are in one place of the world which has become a desert and transfer them to another part of the world in another country where the land has become fertile. It's not that simple. The world has become a series of geopolitical constraints, and this requires wisdom. It requires humanities, but also technical solutions altogether, and science and technology and innovation, but also humanities, knowledge, understanding interrelations and how those global relations work. So, summarizing it now, before briefly moving on to the last part of the lesson, this is the moral of Anthropocene. It started a long time ago. Not everybody agrees with this, but that's my opinion. Not everybody agrees because some people, and probably this is what happens, some, especially geologists, need a very precise moment in time. So probably they will make it more recent, either with the Industrial Revolution in the 1800 taken as a starting point, because that is where you start to have the slope of the burning of fossil fuels. You see where the CO2 increases in the atmosphere. Or another choice, which possibly might prevail, although it's very sad, it'll start in 1945, that is to say at the end of World War II, when you have the nuclear bombs in Japan, and right up to the 1960, they have more than 500 nuclear tests underground, but also in the atmosphere and on the surface. Why will they choose that? Because unfortunately, even in millions of years, even in hundreds of thousands of years, geologists of the future will be able to identify through the radioactive isotopes the levels of transition, and that's where the Anthropocene will start. So the ones who will live after me and after you too will look for a watershed point and to see where it starts. Clearly, it's not a nice moment, but Anthropocene has many intertwined aspects, very difficult to measure, but you need a very complex system. The deep past sheds a light on the present. I've spoken about the Neanderthal chromosome to everything, to study the distant past. Strangely, but clearly helps you understand the distant future. That is to say, the one which will come in many years to come. And then ambivalent. The human presence is ambivalent. We know that we are not sustainable in terms of the biosphere, but we should also remember that in terms of the order of magnitude has changed, in the sense that there is an increase of power, of human power. And now, bearing in mind that key, we can see a case in point, once again a specific one of these ingredients, one part of the Anthropocene. I will do it very quickly and then you can discuss it, and that is the sixth extinction. And to understand why it is called the sixth extinction will give us an idea of the story. This scientist is called Richard Leakey. He's very elderly now, but still active, and he was one of the great scientists that have made it possible for us to retrace human evolution, which we saw in those maps with evolution, Richard Leakey. But he's also a person who has defended biodiversity and a conservationist in Kenya, where he lives. A long time ago, more than 25 years ago, Richard Leakey wrote a book with other scientists, with Edward Wilson, who is the one who invented the term biodiversity in Harvard, with Niles Eldredge, who's a great evolutionary scientist who was my professor in the US. They made provocation. Again, we're always there, sometimes in science, and this is thanks to humanities, the ability to understand the philosophical and narrative aspects of science. Once again, these scientists suggested a new word, a new way of speaking, a sixth extinction, calculating things very simply. These people studied evolution like me, so they studied the past, and they knew, as we know, that if we look at geological time, in the past million of years, there have been some great catastrophes. For example, this happens in evolution every now and again. There have been some great changes on a large scale that generate or lead to a mass extinction. This means that more than 65% of all the forms of life on Earth disappear. It's an enormous catastrophe. Now, we know these, we have known these for time, we know what the causes are, and we also know what happens in the course of these extinction. 25 years ago, these researchers said, look out, what is happening now is comparable to the 5 previous extinctions. Therefore, what is happening now is a 6th extinction. A definition which, as from COP26, has entered the list of challenges, of the great challenges of the next decades. I smile because the first time in which they suggested it, these people who I look up at as masters 25 years ago, they were told that they were catastrophic people, that there was no data on this, that it was an overstatement, an exaggeration, that nothing could be done, so on and so forth. And this means that they were not taken seriously. Edward Wilson wrote this book. It's really a book on the diversity of life, and it shows how the rate of extinction of species is probably underestimated, because we only know a percentage of the species. We have christened, so to speak, 2 million species, giving them a name, but probably there are 8 million, 10 million, we don't know. So we really don't know a lot about biodiversity, but that notwithstanding, we are destroying it. Once again, you see how the deep past can shed light on the present and future. Here you see the 5 big extinctions of the past. You can see them listed very clearly. In the past 500 million years, if we go from right to left, biodiversity tends to increase, but you see that every now and again there are destructions. This is when we have the big mass extinctions, those yellow triangles. And you see that 250 million years ago, virtually all biodiversity disappeared. That's the Permian, the worst one. And in fact, 92% of all the forms of life on Earth became extinct. And it started again with 8% of the biodiversity. And there was one species of mammalian reptile, which was a reptile that was close to mammals, that developed into mammals. So we nearly missed out on surviving and biodiversity every time. There's an extinction, it goes back to growing. These great watersheds had been seen by a great French paleontologist Georges Cuvier, at the beginning of the 1800s, that had observed them in the water basin of the River Seine, and said that these were the watersheds, these were the great divides of the geological eras. We can see it in fossils. This is a wonderful discovery which was found in Tanis, Hell Creek Formation, and you can see the demise of the dinosaurs. You can see all these animals that are all one on top of the other, died and through asphyxia, probably hit by small burning spheres. It's the sign of the tsunami, the impact of the asteroid, if you'll excuse me using the word tsunami, but the asteroid, it's like a photo of what happened. But why does this concern us? Well, it concerns us for a very specific technical idea. We discovered that in each one of these catastrophes of the past, there are things that are repeated. These mass extinction, every time there's a mass extinction, there is an accelerated climate change. There is an unusual alteration of atmosphere composition, and also, as well as these two elements, there is the third element, that is to say, an ecological stress with abnormal intensity. The result of all this is a perfect storm, that is to say, not an extinction like others, it's a mass extinction, as if it were the storm of storms, the extinction of extinction, which leads to the loss of between 2/3 and 3/4 of species. When these articles were first published, which is very interesting, all the authors of these models said, but doesn't this remind you of something? Isn't this something rather familiar? Climate change, alteration of the atmosphere, and ecological stress? Yes, it's called Homo sapiens. Well, this is exactly what happened now. So, Richard Leakey and the others had simply suggested as a metaphor 25 years ago is now science. It's fact. It's quantitative science. Here you can see a very interesting review from Nature, which answers the question, has the Earth's sixth mass extinction already arrived? And the answer is yes. It's here with us. If we look at the rates of extinction of biodiversity, they are the ones of the accelerated beginning of a mass extinction. So once again, you can see that quotation, if we don't act now to interrupt it, we will have to expect terrible results. Here you can see these. You can see the black line, which is very sad, is the line of no return, the tipping point. There will be a catastrophic extinction over 70%, and you can see that for the various animal groups, some of them are very close to it. The same thing can be seen In this other image, which once again from the website, where you can find your data, and you can see that the percentages are a little more precise, and you can see where the process has no return. The skeptics have accepted it. This is a special issue of Science published a few years ago where these figures were updated. They're more precise now, so they've been made clearer. We are now able to calculate not only of the extinction of the species, but also of the reduction of the abundance of members of the species. And unfortunately, things have got even worse because we've discovered, for example, that even invertebrates like insects, while we thought that insects were more resistant to climate change and so on, no, they're not. They too are declining, about 35%. Is this to our advantage? No, it isn't. Absolutely not. Why? Because biodiversity and the species that make up biodiversity are the engineers of the biosystem. We saw this in the first and second lesson. Here you can see it within a general framework. Why are they the engineers of the ecosystem? Because you see that biodiversity is directly proportional to a series of ecosystem services that plants and animals give us. Here you can see it, water recycling, the fertility of the land, pollination of plants. I think that 75% of all plants in the world, which we then eat and so on, depend directly or indirectly on the pollinators. So if you reduce insects by 35%, means that you're going to have a damage that you can quantify and which economists are still not calculating correctly. So what's the problem is that these ecosystemic systems aren't paid for. They're free. Nature gives them to us freely, no cost. If by destroying biodiversity they become much rarer, they will have to be paid, and this is a law of economies. So it is not to our advantage from any point of view. So on the one hand, this is why you have philosophy, and humanities. This is why they're important, because philosophy tells us we have no right to extinguish the other species. So there's a matter of principle whereby we mustn't do it. But there's also a pragmatic use. That is to say, it is not to our advantage, because if we do it, then we too will have to pay consequences for it. And so here you can see the reduction of biodiversity in the world throughout. Basically, we are creating this mass extinction. We have no alibi. We know what the causes of this extinction is. Here you can see them listed. This is Edward Wilson, who taught us how to understand how the mass extinction develops. We have deforestation, invasive species, population growth, pollution, overfishing and overhunting. And only lastly, climate change, which interacts negatively, well, positively in the sense that it amplifies and therefore negatively, with all the other causes. So we know exactly how we are destroying biodiversity. When in future you will hear people talking about systemic problem or systemic solutions, this is what it means. If the causes are all the ones which I've listed here that then interact the ones with the other, clearly we will not find a solution to the mass extinction just by working on one. We will have to find a way for them to interact the one with the others, finding the interactions amongst all these causes. So, and with this I am concluding with a bit of irony and a bit of a joke. First, if we put ourselves in a dangerous position and destroy the ecosystemic services, we might be considered a self-threatened species. This is a provocation that I made at a conference, an international conference. We are a species that threaten their own survival and the survival of future generations, which is not right, at risk, because you are the ones that are there for the future, a bit like the Irish elk. It wasn't even the Irish elk it's called, but it wasn't Irish and it wasn't an elk. But in any case, it contributed to its extinction because these males had these giant antlers for sexual selection, and due to the change of the environment, they didn't work, and so they became extinct. But the Irish elk didn't realize that it was becoming extinct. It didn't have all the facts and figures, while we are a self-endangered species and we are the self-proclaimed sapiens. And I would like to just go over what we discussed in this lesson with a final message, and then we will meet at lesson 4. First of all, catastrophes have always been there. It's always there, and that climate change or global warming is part of it. But the current one is unique in the sense that it has a unique feature. When people say, well, climate has always changed, catastrophes have always been there, it's not a reason to underestimate what is happening, because in any case, even though what is happening now is part of an ancient history, what is happening now is the Great Acceleration, which was the beginning of this lesson. The sixth extinction is not to our advantage, so once again it is a retroactive process which will harm us. We know the causes, so we have no alibi. No alibi. We can't say we didn't know. Beware. Last message I'm leaving you with, and then we'll mention it and talk about it in lesson 4. All these scenarios, these great global challenges which we have outlined are something that might lead us to really be catastrophic. No. I gave you the example of the Montreal Protocol. This is another example. Harvard, Edward Wilson, who is an expert in biodiversity, worked with mathematicians and statisticians, and they developed a model. And they said, let's try and calculate what part of the world's surface we have to protect, not meaning that there have to be no humans and they have to be like a virgin forest, but just protect it. So stop deforestation, pollution, and so on, intervening with on those causes. What percentage? So as to interrupt the sixth extinction. Slow down, and the curve should slow down. Clearly, you can't go back to what it was. The species that are extinct, but to stop it. And here you can see the calculation, and it's 50%. Half of the Earth, including the oceans, where we don't usually live, including all the marine reservations and the ones on land. We have to protect 50% of our land so as to slow down the sixth extinction round about to 2050. Is it realistic? Well, it depends on us. That's his conclusion. We say it's our choice. Right now, we're already between 15 and 20% of the land and seas protected. We have to go from 20 to 50%. Will we be successful? It's up to us, but it's not catastrophic, because this is a model that tells you once again that if we act, and we make certain decisions with scientific models, so with your contribution as engineers, the results will be visible, and we will also know when they will be seen. So this, once again, is an example, a case in point of how engineering and science with humanities, sociology, psychology, and philosophy can give us a scenario which is the best to solve the problems created by a great challenge such as this. Next time, we will be discussing this interface between science and humanities, not from a historical, but from a methodological point of view. Thank you.